Shaq was just being himself, minding his own business, when a sharp voice cut through the luxury hotel lobby. "This place isn't for people like you." The room fell silent. Eyes turned. Cameras started rolling. But instead of reacting with anger, Shaq just smiled. Because what happened next didn't just silence his doubters. It shook the entire hotel industry, exposed a millionaire's darkest secret, and left the world in absolute shock. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The janitor's hands trembled as he stared at the crisp $100 bills stacked neatly in his calloused palms. His breath hitched. This wasn't just a tip. It was his entire year's salary sitting right there, more money than he had ever held at once. His eyes darted up to the man who had just handed it to him, Shaquille O'Neal, towering at 7 feet 1 inch, dressed in a simple hoodie and sneakers, yet commanding more presence than any of the suited billionaires lounging around the extravagant hotel lobby. The scent of expensive cologne and aged whiskey lingered in the air, mingling with the faint polish of the gold chandeliers and gleaming marble floors. This was a place where wealth ruled, where the ultra-elite moved through the world as if they owned it. And right now they were all staring. The janitor, Mr. Rodriguez, a man in his late 60s with weathered skin and tired eyes, looked up in disbelief, his lips parted, his voice shaky. "Sir, I can't accept this." Before he could finish, a voice slashed through the air like a blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Heads turned. The entire lobby fell silent. Striding toward them, face twisted in fury, was Richard Lancaster, the billionaire owner of the hotel. His hand-tailored charcoal suit barely concealed his growing rage, his piercing blue eyes burning with indignation. He wasn't just angry, he was insulted. "Who gave you permission to hand out charity to my employees?" Lancaster spat, his polished dress shoes clicking against the marble floor. His voice dripped with disgust, his gaze shifting between Shaq and the stunned janitor. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. He simply observed Lancaster, his massive frame unshaken by the billionaire's outrage. "This isn't charity," Shaq said, voice low but firm. "It's respect." A few guests whispered amongst themselves. Their curiosity piqued. Some clutched their champagne flutes a little tighter, shifting uncomfortably at the scene unfolding before them. Others watched intently, sensing that something big was about to happen. Lancaster scoffed, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. "Respect? You think tossing a pile of money at the help is respect? I run a world-class establishment, not a handout station." Mr. Rodriguez shrank back, his fingers gripping the money like it was a live wire. He tried to push it back towards Shaq, his face pleading. "Please, sir, I don't want to lose my job." Shaq's jaw tightened. "Keep it," he said simply, folding his arms across his chest. His gaze locked onto Lancaster's with a quiet, unshakable challenge. The tension in the room thickened like a storm cloud. And then, Lancaster turned to the nearest security guard and barked the words that changed everything. "Security! Get that man out of here, now!" Shaq turned slowly, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the pristine marble floor. He knew that voice, and he knew the type. Arrogance, entitlement. A man so used to control that the very idea of someone challenging him sent him into a blind rage. Richard Lancaster stormed forward, his face twisted with indignation, his perfectly styled silver hair slightly out of place from his fury. The billionaire hotel owner was accustomed to being the most powerful man in any room, but today that wasn't the case. "I don't tolerate handouts to the help in my establishment," Lancaster snapped, his voice cutting through the now silent lobby. His expensive Rolex glinted under the chandelier lights as he gestured toward the janitor, his lips curled in disgust. Shaq remained unfazed, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a knowing smirk just barely tugging at the corner of his lips. "Handout," Shaq repeated, rolling the word over like it was foreign to him. He glanced at the elderly janitor, still gripping the money like it might disappear at any moment. "Nah, I call it respect." Lancaster scoffed, shaking his head with a bitter laugh. "Respect?" He looked around, as if searching for validation from the other wealthy guests who had been watching. Some averted their gaze, not wanting to get involved. Others smirked, enjoying the spectacle of a billionaire facing off against a basketball legend. Lancaster turned back to Shaq, his sneer deepening. You think you can just walk into my hotel and throw money around like it changes something? This is my domain, my rules. With a dramatic wave of his hand, he signaled to security. Get him out. Now! The two uniformed guards hesitated, exchanging a glance. Even they knew who Shaq was. This wasn't some random rich guy causing a scene. This was Shaquille O'Neal, NBA champion, businessman, and a man with power beyond money. The janitor, still trembling, immediately tried to return the money. His voice was barely a whisper. Please, sir, I don't want to cause trouble. Shaq didn't even look at him, and he just shook his head. Nah, that's yours. His voice was calm, unshakable. Lancaster's nostrils flared as he watched the interaction. He was used to control, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't the one holding the power. Shaq slowly folded his arms across his broad chest, tilting his head slightly, his smirk now fully formed. Let's see how that works out for you. Lancaster's eye twitched. He had no idea how badly he had just messed up. The tension in the lobby was thick enough to choke on. The security guards hesitated, shifting uncomfortably as they glanced between Shaq and Lancaster, unsure if they really wanted to put their hands on a 7-foot NBA legend in front of a growing audience. But Shaq? He wasn't even fazed. Instead of resisting, instead of arguing, instead of throwing his weight around like Lancaster expected, Shaq calmly pulled out his phone. The room, already buzzing with whispers, fell dead silent. Lancaster folded his arms, his smirk dripping with condescension. Oh, I see what this is, he scoffed. Gonna call one of your celebrity friends? Maybe get a little social media sympathy? Hate to break it to you, big guy, but you're in my world now. And in my world, he gestured around at the polished marble floors and glittering chandeliers. You don't belong. Shaq didn't look at him, didn't react. He simply put the phone to his ear and spoke, calmly and deliberately. Yeah, he said, his voice even. I need that favor. Right now. For a moment, nothing happened. The guards, still waiting for a command, glanced at Lancaster for confirmation. Then, the elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open. A group of sharply dressed individuals strode in, their presence immediately commanding respect. Men and women in tailored suits, polished shoes, exuding power. But what made the color drain from Lancaster's face was who they were. The hotel's board of directors, and they looked furious. The lead director, a steely-eyed man in his 60s, stepped forward. Richard, he said, voice clipped, mind explaining why we just got an emergency alert that our second-largest shareholder was being forcibly removed from the premises? Lancaster blinked. Second largest? He stopped mid-sentence, his head snapping toward Shaq. Shaq finally turned to him, grinning like a man who had just checkmated his opponent. Turns out, he said, slipping his phone back into his pocket, I just bought a 40% stake in this hotel. The gasp that rippled through the lobby was almost deafening. Lancaster's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You... what? His voice cracked, disbelief plastered across his face. Shaq just shrugged. Guess that means I'm not just a guest anymore. Lancaster stumbled back a step, his world spinning. He had severely underestimated the man standing in front of him, and now it was too late. For the first time since his outburst, Richard Lancaster was speechless. His face twisted into something unreadable, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and barely restrained fury. The once confident hotel mogul, who had commanded this five-star establishment like a king in his castle, now looked like a man watching his empire crack beneath his feet. Shaq, however, remained unshaken. He didn't gloat, didn't rush to rub it in. He simply stood tall, his hands casually in his pockets, his presence alone suffocating Lancaster's authority. The silence in the lobby was thick with tension. No one moved. Even the guests who had been quietly observing the spectacle now leaned in, their curiosity morphing into stunned fascination. Finally, one of the board members stepped forward, adjusting his navy blue tie. His voice was clipped, professional, but with an undertone of frustration. Richard, is it true? Did you really attempt to throw out one of our largest investors? Lancaster's lips parted, but no sound came out. His mind was spinning, searching for a way to turn this around, but nothing came. The board member sighed, shaking his head. Unbelievable. Shaq smiled, just enough to let Lancaster know he had already lost this round. You know, Shaq said, his voice smooth and measured, I was just planning to make a silent investment. Let my money work in the background. But then you decided to put on a little show. And now, he turned slightly, gesturing toward the growing crowd of guests. some of whom had already pulled out their phones. The murmurs in the room grew louder. Wait, Shaq owns part of this hotel? No way. That changes everything. A woman in a tailored dress whispered to her husband, if he's involved, I trust the place a lot more. A voice suddenly broke through the noise. Excuse me, Shaq, can you confirm what just happened? Everyone turned toward the source, a young journalist standing near the concierge desk, holding up her phone, already streaming live. You really just bought into this hotel? She asked, her excitement barely contained. Shaq's grin widened. That's right, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly. 40%? That makes me the second biggest shareholder. He turned back to Lancaster, tilting his head. So, still want to kick me out? Lancaster's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. His empire, his pride, his control over the hotel, all of it was slipping. He could feel it. He glanced around the room, hoping to see someone on his side. But all he saw were cameras pointed at him, guests whispering about his failure, board members shaking their heads in disappointment. His face burned with humiliation. Then, voice low and venomous, he hissed through gritted teeth, "You won't get away with this." But Shaq wasn't worried. He just smirked, knowing Lancaster's downfall had only just begun. The tension in the lobby was already suffocating. But when Shaq's assistant, a sharp-dressed man with an earpiece and a tablet in hand, stepped up beside him, it somehow got even thicker. Leaning in close, the assistant whispered, "We found something." Shaq didn't react right away. Instead, he let the words settle, his gaze never leaving Lancaster, who was still fuming, still desperate to regain control. "Yeah?" Shaq muttered, tilting his head slightly. "Is it good?" His assistant's lips curled into a knowing smirk. "Oh, it's real good." With a casual nod, Shaq stepped forward, standing at the very center of the room as the massive screen behind the reception desk flickered to life. At first, it was just numbers, rows upon rows of employee wages, too small for most to read. But within seconds, the data enlarged, highlighting a disturbing reality. The staff of Lancaster's five-star luxury hotel, janitors, housekeepers, kitchen workers, were making barely above minimum wage. Gasps rippled through the lobby. The guests, who had been enjoying their drinks and casually watching the drama unfold, were suddenly not so entertained anymore. A woman in a pearl necklace turned to her husband. "Is this real?" One of the employees standing in the back, a housekeeper in a neatly pressed uniform, covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide. Meanwhile, Lancaster went pale. "This is a private matter," he barked, his voice echoing through the now silent room. Shaq simply raised an eyebrow. "Not anymore." Lancaster whirled around, snapping at his staff. "Shut it down." Now, a tech employee behind the desk frantically tapped at his keyboard, but it was useless. The files had already been pulled up, and now everyone could see them. Shaq crossed his arms. "See, I was just planning to sit back and let my investment do its thing. Let you run this place while I collected a nice little check on the side." He shook his head. "But then you had to go and be the worst possible version of yourself." A journalist in the crowd scribbled notes furiously. The cameras kept rolling. Lancaster's breathing turned sharp. He knew what this meant. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a career-ending disaster. And then a voice broke through the crowd. It was the janitor. Mr. Rodriguez, the same elderly man Shaq had defended just minutes ago, stared at the screen with his mouth slightly open. His fingers trembled as he pointed at the highlighted numbers. "Is that my pay record?" Shaq exhaled slowly, glancing between Mr. Rodriguez and Lancaster. "Yeah, it is." The weight of silence in the hotel lobby was unbearable. The numbers on the screen loomed over everyone, cold and undeniable. A five-star luxury hotel, charging thousands per night, yet its staff, the very people who kept it running, were barely scraping by. Mr. Rodriguez's voice trembled as he stared at the screen, his fingers tracing over his own name. I knew my paychecks felt short sometimes, but this," his voice cracked, "this is theft." A murmur spread through the room. Housekeepers, bellhops, and kitchen staff stepped forward from the edges of the lobby, eyes locked on the damning evidence. A young woman, still in her uniform, turned to her coworker. "That explains why our overtime never showed up." Another staff member shook his head. "And why we never got holiday pay. I thought it was just a mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. It was a system, and that system had just been dragged into the light for the entire world to see. Lancaster's face twisted in fury. He slammed his fist on the check-in counter, his voice breaking the spell of silence. "This is a gross violation of privacy," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at Shaq. "You have no right to interfere in my business." Shaq, calm as ever, took a step forward, hands in his pockets. "No right." He gestured toward the crowd of underpaid employees. "Tell them that." The guests, who had been watching like spectators at a high-stakes match, exchanged disgusted glances. A businessman in a tailored suit muttered to his wife, "I can't believe we've been staying here." A socialite, wrapped in designer silk, whispered, "This place treats their workers like garbage. I'm booking a different hotel." The front desk phones began ringing, cancellations pouring in. The receptionist, who had once operated with forced smiles, now looked at Lancaster with barely disguised contempt. A frantic employee from the back office rushed up to him, tablet in hand, voice shaking. "Sir, we just lost 30 reservations in the past 5 minutes." Lancaster's skin turned a shade paler. "No, no, no!" He snatched the tablet, scanning the damage. His wealthiest clients were pulling out, backing away from the scandal before it burned their reputations too. He spun toward Shaq, his breathing heavy, his once polished composure now in shambles. "You can't do this," he hissed. "I built this empire." Shaq tilted his head, considering him for a moment. Then a slow, knowing smirk curled across his lips. "Oh," Shaq said smoothly, "I'm just getting started." Lancaster sat in his private office, his hands gripping the edge of his mahogany desk as he scrolled through his phone, reading the news updates. Every major outlet was covering the story: Shaquille O'Neal's sudden investment in the Lancaster Grand Hotel, the whispers of poor staff treatment, and the rising murmurs of discontent among guests and employees alike. The walls of his empire were beginning to crack, and Lancaster knew that if he didn't act fast, the entire structure would come crashing down around him. He took a slow, deliberate breath, closing his eyes for a moment. He had built this hotel chain from the ground up, using his connections, wealth, and influence to climb to the top. He had shut down competitors, crushed lawsuits, silenced employees who dared to speak out against him. A man like him didn't just lose, not to some former athlete with a hero complex. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Get my PR team in here, now." Within minutes, his top strategists filled the room, their faces tense but determined. He leaned forward, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "We need to turn this narrative around," he said, his voice calm but cold. "By tomorrow morning, I want headlines everywhere calling Shaq a bully, a corporate tyrant, a man using his money to trample over small businesses." He smirked slightly. "People love an underdog story. Let's make me the underdog." His head of public relations nodded swiftly. "We can plan a few stories in business magazines, pay off some online influencers, maybe leak a report saying Shaq's planning to fire half the hotel staff and replace them with his own team." Lancaster's smile widened. "Now you're thinking." By dawn, headlines flooded the internet. Shaquille O'Neal strong-arms his way into luxury hotel. NBA legend accused of business bullying. Hotel at risk. Shaq's takeover. Bad for employees, worse for business. Social media was ablaze with debates. Some believed Shaq was trying to do the right thing, but others, especially those influenced by Lancaster's well-placed stories, were starting to see him as a villain. At the Lancaster Grand Hotel, a sense of unease filled the air. Employees whispered among themselves, uncertain of their future. Would they still have jobs? Would Shaq really fire them all? The uncertainty was working in Lancaster's favor. Confident that he had regained control of the narrative, Lancaster strutted into the lobby, phone in hand, reading the latest reports just loud enough for others to hear. "Oh, this is just brilliant," he muttered, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. "Shaquille O'Neal, the big bad billionaire, crushing small businesses." He chuckled and turned toward the VIP lounge. There, sitting in a plush leather chair, was Shaq. Unlike the nervous employees around him, he wasn't rattled. He wasn't reading the headlines, wasn't pacing in frustration. Instead, he sat there, completely composed, sipping a cup of coffee as if he had all the time in the world. Lancaster stopped in front of him, smirking. "So?" he drawled, tucking his phone into his pocket. "How's it feel to be the bad guy for once?" Shaq glanced up, raising a brow but saying nothing. Lancaster took his silence as a win. "People don't like bullies, you know. And right now you look like the biggest bully of them all." He folded his arms, his grin growing. "What happened to the big lovable guy who just wanted to help the little people?" Shaq exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate ease. He adjusted his watch, then finally looked Lancaster in the eye. His voice was smooth, unbothered. "You done?" Lancaster's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly. "Oh no, I'm just getting started. I—" A buzz of notifications interrupted him. Phones all around the lobby started pinging, screens lighting up with breaking news alerts. Employees glanced down, confusion spreading across their faces as a new story began taking over. Lancaster frowned, pulling out his phone. As he refreshed his screen, his expression darkened instantly. Breaking. Secret offshore account linked to Richard Lancaster. Millions in employee wages missing. The color drained from his face. Screens around the hotel, lobby TVs, employee tablets, even the news ticker behind the front desk were all displaying the same story. Lancaster's hidden bank accounts, his shady dealings, his financial cover-ups, it was all out. He turned back to Shaq, his voice suddenly hoarse. How did you—" Shaq leaned back, arms crossed, a small smirk playing at his lips. "You tried to play the game," he murmured, shaking his head. "But you forgot one thing." Lancaster's jaw clenched. "What?" Shaq's grin widened. "I play to win." A sharp voice echoed through the hotel lobby, drawing everyone's attention. "Mr. Lancaster, we need to talk." Lancaster turned slowly, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. His stomach twisted at the sight of two uniformed police officers stepping toward him. As they reached for their handcuffs, Lancaster's world came crashing down. The flash of cameras lit up the lobby like a thunderstorm, the rapid-fire clicks blending into a chaotic symphony of scandal. The once pristine marble floor of the Lancaster Grand Hotel, where only the wealthiest, most powerful figures in society once tread with arrogance, was now a stage for its fallen king to be dragged across. Richard Lancaster's hands were locked behind his back, metal cuffs biting into his wrists as the police officers flanked him on either side. His once expensive tailored suit now seemed ill-fitting, as though his power had been stripped from him along with his reputation. His face, usually a mask of superiority, was pale and tight with suppressed rage and disbelief. "This is a mistake," Lancaster barked, his voice cracking as he tried to shake off the officer's grip. "You can't do this. I built this empire." But no one was listening. The very employees he had belittled, underpaid and overworked, stood watching, some with wide eyes, others with quiet, unspoken satisfaction. The same guests who once scrambled to be in his good graces now kept their distance, whispering amongst themselves. And the reporters? They were like vultures circling fresh prey, microphones and cameras thrust toward his face. "Mr. Lancaster, is it true you've been hiding millions in stolen wages? Do you have any comments on the offshore accounts? Was this all a cover-up? Who else is involved? Mr. Lancaster, do you regret your actions?" The questions were relentless, each one hammering at the last remnants of his once mighty reputation. But Lancaster was too furious to stay silent. He turned his glare toward one person. Shaq. The NBA legend stood tall amidst the chaos, his arms crossed, watching it all unfold with an expression that was unreadable. Calm, patient, but unshaken. He had already won this battle before it even began. Lancaster sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're a hero?" His breath was ragged as he spat the words. "You think you've done something great here? You're just another rich guy throwing his weight around." Shaq took a slow step forward, his massive frame making Lancaster seem even smaller, weaker, and more insignificant. "You had everything," Shaq said, his deep voice steady but firm. "All the money, all the power, and you wasted it on greed." He glanced around at the hotel staff, the same people who had been mistreated for years. "These people built your empire, and you treated them like dirt." Lancaster opened his mouth, but no words came out. The weight of the truth was crushing. Shaq turned toward the employees now, giving them his full attention. "Y'all deserve better." His voice carried through the lobby, filled with something Lancaster had never given them: respect. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of relief, curiosity, and hope. The police officers began leading Lancaster toward the exit, but he resisted, his body jerking in protest. "This isn't over. You hear me?" His voice grew shrill as the camera zoomed in. "I will get my company back. I will come back from this. And when I do—" But the automatic doors slid open behind him. Outside, a wall of reporters and angry former employees awaited him, their cameras flashing like 1,000 tiny explosions. Protesters held signs condemning his treatment of workers. His name, once a symbol of power, was now synonymous with disgrace. His steps faltered. The fight was draining out of him. He knew in that moment that there was no coming back from this. Inside the hotel, as the doors slid shut, the tension in the air seemed to dissolve. The empire Lancaster had ruled with an iron grip no longer belonged to him. A journalist turned toward Shaq, voice eager. "What happens to the hotel now?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let a slow grin spread across his face. He glanced at the employees, the people who truly ran this hotel, before answering. "Let's just say, things are about to change." The hotel had been a battlefield of power, wealth, and ego. But now, as the dust settled, it was clear who stood victorious. Shaq didn't just take down Lancaster, he was about to build something better in his place. The once tense lobby had transformed. The same employees who had once worked in fear now gathered, anticipation gleaming in their eyes. Some whispered among themselves, others simply stared, waiting for what came next. This was their home, their livelihood, and for the first time in years it was about to change for the better. Shaq stood before them, his presence commanding yet reassuring. He wasn't just another rich man walking through these halls. He had fought for them, and now he was leading them forward. "Things are going to be different from now on," Shaq announced, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "Better pay, fair hours, real respect. That starts today." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Could this really be happening? Shaq turned his attention to the elderly janitor, Mr. Rodriguez, the same man who had been mocked and humiliated just days before. The man who had spent decades serving the hotel, yet had never been given a single moment of recognition. "You," Shaq pointed at him, a small smile playing at his lips. "How long you been working here?" Rodriguez hesitated, his wrinkled hands tightening around the mop handle. 30 years, sir." His voice was thick with emotion. I always thought I'd retire here." Shaq nodded. "Good. Then it's about time you stop pushing that mop." Gasps spread through the room. The janitor's eyes widened. "From today, you're the new supervisor." A stunned silence followed. Then, applause. Loud, roaring, genuine applause. The employees, the ones who had been ignored for years, suddenly felt seen. Rodriguez's lips trembled, his weathered face filled with disbelief. I don't know what to say." Shaq patted his shoulder. "Say you'll do the job right." Tears welled in the old man's eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of struggle. They were tears of gratitude. The moment was caught on camera, and within hours, social media exploded. A single post went viral, capturing the moment Shaq lifted the janitor's hand in victory. The caption? "I'm only staying at Shaq's hotel from now on." Richard Lancaster had spent years believing that money could fix anything. A reputation? Bought? A scandal? Buried? An enemy? Crushed? He had built an empire on arrogance, intimidation, and greed. But as he sat alone in his dimly lit office, his new office, which was nothing more than a rented space in a failing hotel on the outskirts of town, he realized something terrifying. For the first time in his life, money couldn't save him. His downfall had been swift. The moment news broke about his illegal business dealings, his name became radioactive. Investors pulled out, business partners cut ties. The hospitality industry, the same world where he had once been king, now treated him like a plague. But Lancaster refused to go down without a fight. He poured what little remained of his fortune into a new project, a luxury hotel chain, meant to rival the very empire Shaq had taken from him. He promised investors that he would rebuild, that he would return stronger. The ads were flashy, the branding expensive, and for a moment it looked like he might pull it off, until the staff never showed up. No managers, no housekeepers, no chefs, nobody. Lancaster slammed his fist against his desk, his face red with frustration as his assistant delivered the news. "Sir, we can't hire anyone. No one wants to work for you." He gritted his teeth. "Pay them more." His assistant swallowed hard. "It's not about the money." That was when Lancaster saw it, the headline that destroyed whatever hope he had left. Shaq Hotels named number 1. Luxury chain in America, his vision blurred as he read through the article. The very hotel he had once owned was now part of a global success story. Employees praised Shaq for his fair wages and treatment. Guests raved about the world-class service. Celebrities and business elites flocked to Shaq's properties, while Lancaster's attempt at a comeback crumbled before it even began. His hands trembled as he scrolled through the comments. Shaq turned this into something legendary. Who would ever work for a crook like Lancaster? This guy really thought he could make a comeback? LMO. Shaq's hotels are booked solid. Lancaster can't even book a janitor. The final blow came when he saw a picture of Shaq standing in front of his flagship hotel, shaking hands with his employees. People who used to work under Lancaster but had left to follow a real leader. A wave of rage, regret, and helplessness crashed over him. He had lost everything. He sat back, his hands clenched into fists, watching in horror as Shaq's empire flourished, while his own dreams burned to the ground. The camera lights flickered on, illuminating the grand lobby of Shaq's newly rebranded luxury hotel, where journalists and reporters had gathered for an exclusive interview. Shaq, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, leaned back in his chair, his massive hands resting on the polished wooden table. He wasn't here to gloat. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about setting an example. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman from a top business network, adjusted her mic. Shaq, a year ago, this hotel was owned by Richard Lancaster, a man who built his empire on exploitation. Today, under your leadership, it's the most successful luxury chain in the country. What's your secret? Shaq exhaled, his deep voice steady but firm. It's simple. Respect your workers, treat them right, and they'll build something bigger than you ever imagined. The room was silent, hanging on to every word. He continued, see, people like Lancaster, they think success is built on cutting corners, squeezing employees, treating people like they don't matter. But real success, that comes from lifting others up. The journalist nodded. And what do you say to those who doubted you? The ones who called you just an athlete, who thought you didn't belong in this industry? Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. I say, look around. The camera panned across the transformed hotel. The staff, now smiling and confident, moved through the space with a renewed sense of pride. The janitors, the front desk workers, the waiters, all of them had seen their wages increased, their benefits improved, and their dignity restored. Among them stood Mr. Rodriguez, the elderly janitor who had once been humiliated in this very lobby. Now, he wore a manager's suit, his posture straight, his expression beaming with gratitude. The interviewer turned to him. Mr. Rodriguez, a year ago, you were cleaning these floors under Lancaster's rule. What's changed for you? Rodriguez took a deep breath, his voice slightly shaky but filled with emotion. Everything. I used to be invisible, just another worker people ignored. But Mr. O'Neill, he saw me. He treated me with dignity. And now, I don't just clean this hotel, I help run it. Applause rippled through the room. Shaq smiled, leaning forward. See, this isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been told they don't belong. Every worker who's been stepped on by someone who thought they were better. The broadcast aired nationwide, reaching millions. People watched, inspired. But in one small living room, a moment happened that Shaq would never forget. A young boy sat cross-legged on the floor, eyes glued to the TV. As Shaq spoke, the boy turned to his father and whispered, I want to be like him. The afternoon sun bathed the grand entrance of the Lancaster Hotel, now rebranded as Shaq's Legacy Suites, in a golden glow. Once a playground for the elite, the place had transformed into something much greater, a beacon of fairness, dignity, and second chances. Shaq stepped through the revolving doors, his massive frame drawing eyes from guests and employees alike. But today he wasn't here to make a statement. He had already won. Across the lobby, a figure stood near the front desk, shoulders slumped, head down, a stark contrast to the man who used to bark orders in this very spot. Richard Lancaster. He had once ruled this hotel like a king, his arrogance unmatched, his power unquestioned. Now he was just another man looking for a job. The former billionaire wore a cheap suit, slightly wrinkled, the collar loose as if it didn't quite fit right. His once polished shoes scuffed against the pristine marble floors he no longer owned. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't the boss. He was an applicant. The irony was impossible to ignore. A man who had built his empire by exploiting workers was now standing in line, waiting for an interview at the very hotel he lost. Shaq took his time crossing the lobby, his steps slow, deliberate. He could feel the tension in the air, the hushed whispers from employees who had once feared Lancaster, now watching as karma played its final hand. Lancaster finally looked up, And when his eyes met Shaq's, his face burned with humiliation, his jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. "I suppose you think this is funny, huh?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq tilted his head slightly, amusement dancing in his eyes. "A little." Lancaster exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This isn't over." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, man, it's over." He gestured around the thriving hotel, the employees smiling, the guests happy, the business booming under his leadership. Everything Lancaster had tried to hold on to was now thriving without him. A long, heavy silence stretched between them before Shaq turned toward the exit. He didn't need to say more. The victory wasn't in words. It was in everything around him. Just as he reached the door, he paused, glanced over his shoulder, and then, with the same smirk that had started this war, he uttered the final words Lancaster would never forget. "You were right about one thing, though. This hotel wasn't built for just anyone. It was built for the people who actually deserve to be here." And with that, Shaq walked out, his laughter echoing behind him. The last laugh was his.